everyone, welcome to another episode of the 30 Days of Activism initiated by the Elite Climate Action, trying to see how we can have more women in decision-making platform and the rest. And today I have with me Abrar that is going to shortly introduce himself. He works on climate finance, and we all know that climate finance is now a cross-cutting issue, that we need climate finance for our climate action to be completed. And without climate finance, there cannot be climate justice. So it goes hand in hand with what we need in solving the defining issue of our time. And at the same time, climate finance goes hand in hand with solving gender-related issues, such as availability of resources, and all it takes for women to have a safe and secure environment for them to be able to exercise their rights. So briefly, Abrar is going to give us a short description of who he is and what we expect from this interaction today. Thank you. So you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Adenike, and thank you for inviting me for this talk. So I'm Dr. Abrar Chaudhury. I'm a research fellow at Oxford Saïd Business School. And really for the past 10 years, I have been focusing on issues around climate change, but really looking at how do we translate global policies, global action on ground. So for me, the important aspect of climate is where climate needs humans. So the socio-ecological system. So I've done lots of work on local communities, on farming communities, to really understand what their challenges are. And one of the kind of insights that comes out of my work is that often the language, the processes, or the structure that are set up at the policy level don't really translate on ground effectively, because people need action, people need information, people need resources, and sometimes they're not in sync. So, for example, you'll have a very nice policy on climate agriculture, which encourages farmers to adopt new practices. But if they're not accompanied by the relevant resources or technologies, then really those practices are not taken up by the farmer. So my work really looks at, how does all this information and knowledge and resources flow on ground, and how does that translate into action on ground?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate, because I've always looked forward for this interview. Because I've seen your brilliant articles, contribution in books and the rest. And I really get it when you talk about how do people benefit from climate finance. Because recently there was a report by Carbon Brief that mentioned that Global South, or those countries vulnerable to the impact of climate change, are not really benefiting from this climate funds. So what do you think are the problems, like the bane of contention in this crisis? Why are people not benefiting, like people from the global south, that they need this climate finance urgently in order to tackle climate change, so that we don't keep piling up problems, then it becomes a very big issue for us to deal with?
Really important, you bring a really important aspect of this climate justice and climate equity. How do we get money on ground, especially in countries that face the brunt of climate change? So, because in many emerging economies, in many developing economies, the capacity to deal with the impacts of climate change are low. We need more finance, but it really, to understand what climate finance is and what some of those challenges are, we have to look at slightly at the historical context as well. So if you look at climate negotiation or the Rio Agreement, this whole climate structure is based on the concept of CBDR, which is like common but distributed responsibility. And the idea here is that industrialized nations, because they've already developed and have polluted the environment as well, and have caused greenhouse gas emissions, now have a historical obligation to pay developing countries finance if they want them to have better climate practices, or if they want them not to emit. So the whole historical background is based on funding coming from industrial nations to developing countries. And that has been a big contention or big challenge and a big element of the negotiations as well. So in 2015, in the landmark Paris Agreement, one of the big wins was setting up a dedicated climate fund, the Green Climate Fund. And the idea was that all industrialized countries will actually give money to the Green Climate Fund, and the Green Climate Fund will set up mechanisms to actually transfer money to developing countries through projects, through programs, and that's ongoing. There are some successes in that, but there are also many challenges. But I would say the biggest challenge we're facing right now is the commitment coming from industrialized nations. I think the big commitment was that we should have at least $100 billion per year by 2020. And we've seen in the current negotiation that that really hasn't happened. We're getting close to that figure, but there are also a lot of challenges in terms of what gets counted as climate finance, what is development finance, is this really additional money that's coming from industrialized nations? So that challenge is ongoing, like getting the right amount of money that was actually committed. It was not something that's being asked as a donation, but it's being committed as a right for developing countries to get this money. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of these challenges, that the amount of money hasn't come in. So historically, if we know that, in Paris Agreement, the US had committed a certain amount of money, like I think it was $2 billion, and they pulled out. So that money didn't come in. Now they're already back in, but there are also domestic issues, because a lot of challenges that these industrialized nations have is that their populations are also suffering with climate change. So they're expecting that the money should actually be spent in country rather than given out to other developing countries. So we have all these kind of geopolitical challenges going on, but the crux is we haven't received the money that was committed to developing countries. And so the $100 billion hasn't really come in. If you look at the Green Climate Fund, so far it's only received roughly about $10 billion. And so that's not enough for us to spend in developing countries. And I think that's some of the bigger challenges.
Yeah, very well. This discussion reminds me of that $100 billion annual commitment of 2009 to 2020, which is now a past thing, and yet nothing has been done. It's also added to the climate change crisis or challenges that we are faced today, that when we don't solve an issue or it is left unresolved, it becomes a very big problem for us to tackle. And that is why in recent time, we have been seeing different cyclones happening, floods, where there are no floods before, the places are now becoming vulnerable. So invariably, the fund is not getting to the grassroots, to those at the top, which are the most vulnerable people, which is very difficult right now. And so I want to ask that what is the big issue here right now in trying to access fund? What are the issues that are defining us from accessing fund? Is it that the fund is not available, or we are the one that couldn't access the fund? Or is there a criteria for us to be able to access this fund of which we are not doing? Or what should country do to access the fund or to get the finance needed? Because it is a right for each country, especially when it comes to Green Climate Fund. It's a right for countries that are vulnerable for them to be given that immunity to get access to funding as quick as possible in order to deal with the loss and damage of the impact of the climate change crisis. So I want to hear your opinion on it.
So Adenike, you're absolutely right. While we're all debating and figuring out and fighting over, where the money will come from, how the money will be spent, what are the mechanisms, climate change is happening. And so we're seeing all these impacts right now. As you mentioned, floods, droughts, they become commonplace. So the urgency is very, very high. Now, the part of the challenge, and I would put it not on the intentions, but I guess the structures that we are used to, the bureaucracy that's part of this whole UN process, is also something that's really inhibiting. So when you look at the Green Climate Fund, its mandate is to give money to developing countries. And the core structure within the Green Climate Fund is this concept of country ownership. That countries, like Nigeria, like Pakistan, other developing countries in the African states, island states, they are the ones who are supposed to develop projects based on the priorities that are important for their country, for their nation. So, for small island states, sea level rise is much more important, as opposed to maybe least developing countries that are looking at improving their agriculture productivity or improving their income. So every country or every region has their own requirements. And the whole premise of the Green Climate Fund or transferring funding to developing country was that it has to start from the country level. So we need to push projects upwards to Green Climate Fund and say, okay, this is what we require. Now, theoretically, the fund cannot say no to projects because they are coming from the country. So, if Nigeria demands funding for agriculture adaptation, the Green Climate Fund is supposed to fund that. Now, the big challenge that comes in are, well, there are few challenges, right? One challenge is that, of course, the Green Climate Fund takes itself as a gatekeeper or as an agent for industrialization. So the standards that they've set to access those funding is very high. They want very robust projects to come forward. They want a very strong climate rationale. And that's been a big bone of contention, because when they talk about climate rationale, what they're really asking for is the project going to have any impact on climate change? Like, will this help us deal with the impacts of climate change? So they're looking for lots of historical data. For example, they'll ask for 30 years of data on climate impacts and then saying, okay, this intervention will come in, this will help us overcome that climate challenge. Many countries don't have that data. So developing the strong climate rationale that satisfies the Green Climate Fund has been a challenge. The second element is that, of course, Green Climate Fund does not have a lot of money. So far, it's roughly $10 billion. They want to spend more money. So they're really looking for transformational projects. Designing these big projects, designing projects that meet all those different criteria of Green Climate Fund, help with local communities, are robust, can be measured, can be tracked, requires a lot of upfront investment and a lot of knowledge. And sometimes that knowledge doesn't reside in areas that suffer the most. Hence, project developers need to find those right expertise. They have to find the consultants. They have to look at the data. They have to bring all these different actors together. And so the upfront time and cost for developing a project can take very long. It can take a year. Sometimes it can take 2 years, but the urgency doesn't stop. So it's creating a lot of frustration at the local country level, at the local community level, where they feel that, this is money that we should be getting. Why are there so many different hurdles? On the positive side, yes, Green Climate Fund is also trying other approaches. They have these fast track funding, they have capacity building funding that they give to the country. But I think all in all, the challenge is that there's so many different requirements that have been set up to meet that criteria that it just inhibits many local organizations to participate in it because they don't have the capacity. So what we're really seeing is that many international organizations, like the UNDP, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, are getting these funds to implement the projects. Now, the challenge with that is that these organizations were already working in this space. They already have their own funds as well. So now they're using Green Climate Fund money to actually do projects. What this inhibits is that it kind of does not allow local communities or local organizations to develop capacity, because most of the money, most of the projects is still coming through multilateral organizations. So I would say the challenges are high bar for project criterias, a lot of documentation, showing climate rationale, and then also having capacity and resources to develop projects and proposals that meet all those criteria.
Yeah, I think from all you have just mentioned now, that is really a big injustice, when those that need to access the form are not getting the fund, it becomes a very big issue, and it leads to a lot of big crisis. And we should all know that we cannot quarantine or isolate from the impact of the climate change crisis. And also, the climate change crisis knows no boundary. If we are left out of climate finance, it's like it's like being vulnerable to the whole world. Like, if Africa is not safe, definitely nowhere is safe, because it will become a big crisis in form of refugee for other nations to deal with. And then it's going to affect foreign policy, leading to travel bans, closure of borders, and the rest. We have seen it with the pandemic. And just very briefly, I just want you to tell us what would have been the possible factors that led to the failure of the $100 billion commitment. I know lack of political will could be one of those strongest facts, but I also want to know the financial cause, like what's in the financial angle or aspect could have been the cause or factors of this crisis. Like, is it because they are not ready to finance the developing countries or vulnerable countries? What is the crisis? Where is the problem? Or maybe it is lack of proper structure or something for the finance. Maybe it was just like a statement, but no action.
Again, it's obviously, when we look at a global level agreement, it's obviously complicated. One of the big wins for the Paris Agreement was bringing many countries together. I think that's where the COP has been successful, is bringing countries together on the table. I think the challenge itself is that every country has its own challenges. We've seen recently in the summers, huge floods in Germany, huge floods in Canada, which means that adaptation is no longer just a developing country challenge. Now, developed countries are facing the same challenges, and so they require lots of funding. Their populations are also demanding that, okay, you are giving money elsewhere, what about us? So I think for countries, it's also about looking at their communities and understanding that climate change is not a problem that's elsewhere. It's their populations. Well, so that is one challenge, that it's about prioritizing money and it's about spending money locally. I think the other challenge that has been is finding the right mechanisms as well. So this whole notion or this whole divide of industrialized nation and developing countries is also changing. We see many countries that are progressing, like China, India, Saudi Arabia. And so this whole debate comes in, okay, are they developing countries? Their emissions are going so high. What actions will these countries take? And should we be giving them money or not? So that becomes a much more broader political debate, which causes lots of challenges. I think for me, one really important way forward is not to wait for money coming from somewhere, right? Yes, that money needs to come in. We need to have finance coming from industrialized nations based on their commitments. But the quantum or the scale of the challenge is too huge. And that's why I feel that countries, like nation states, also have to take responsibility. They have to go from this approach of saying, okay, we need money, to saying, okay, what are the steps that we can take? How do we mobilize our own resources, our own structures to become more climate compatible? And what happens this way is, if you start to take one or two steps forward, you're actually closer to the challenge. You're able to attract more money in, because now you have the structures, you have the institutions, you set up the mechanisms to attract that funding. So many countries, for example, are thinking about setting up their own sovereign climate funds. And the idea for that is to consolidate all the money that comes in, to bring private sector, to bring other entities in that fold. So it's not about, okay, if we get the money, what do we do next? Countries can take a few steps forward as well. And I think that's where I see a lot of progress, that you make that case that, okay, we are already doing a lot for climate change. Here is funding that's coming in from our domestic sources. Here are the structures that we set up. This allows us to unlock and leverage much higher quantum of money rather than just small grants coming in. So I think we also have an opportunity to explore and to create new structure and to create new models, which will allow us to access not just the Green Climate Fund, but many other funding sources as well.
Yeah, very well. I think I got what you have just said when you talked about countries not waiting for either the developed country to cater for all their finance, for them to start something, and it's also very important too that when commitments are made, we should also look at how it becomes a reality, because today we have different commitments but little or no reality on it. It's really affecting climate progress when we keep making commitments and no action on it. So it becomes a very big issue, and we keep asking, how far have we gone? What have we achieved? Because that is what is making us to demand for our rights, because it becomes a right when we make it as a commitment, and yet nothing has been done to it, because it was a statement that was made for those kind of commitments to see how they can support developing countries. But notwithstanding, developing countries can also start doing something to help themselves through different funds it can access. And yeah, very well. So back to our discussion still, I want to ask, is climate finance gender sensitive from your angle? And if yes, or maybe, what is the main explanation? What is the mechanism behind this? Because if it could be difficult for countries to access finance when needed or when necessary, now imagine women and girls that are the burden bearers of the impact of the climate change crisis. How long, how much is going to take them to access such finance? So I want to ask you that question. Is climate finance gender sensitive? How, what, where, and it?
So I think there's a very strong understanding. I think there's a lot of research, a lot of work, a lot of effort has gone in through many fantastic people to raise this issue, that actually women bear a disproportionate brunt of climate change. In many local communities that I worked in, women were the main farming, were supporting in agriculture. In many South Asian countries, we see a mass exodus of people immigrating to other countries for work. And so the brunt of work has been left with women. And I think there's fantastic work that's gone in. So as far as that understanding is concerned, as far as that evidence is concerned, we don't need to make that case anymore. We know that that's happening. We know that when we look at finance, we look at interventions, they're not catered for women, although they're the ones who are bearing a disproportionate amount of brunt for climate change. So for me, I think what's happening, and again, using examples of these larger funds or financial institutions, I think they have a huge responsibility and a huge opportunity, because they're the ones who are setting all these criteria. They are the ones who are saying, okay, this is what needs to happen. We need a climate rationale. We need the project to be governed in this structure. And so funders have a lot of leverage in deciding what happens. And I'm seeing that now, for example, gender is making its way in many of the Green Climate Fund projects. That it's a criteria that they ask, okay, how are we looking at impacts on women? How are we looking at gender? But I think much more needs to be done. I think a much stronger recognition needs to come in that, who are the most vulnerable. If we look at climate change and we look at climate change adaptation, the basic premise is to build adaptive capacity of the least most vulnerable. And so in our case, if women are very vulnerable, then we have to set up strategies. We have to set up projects. We have to set up structures that cater for that. So for me, it's a 2 or 3 tier approach. First approach is, organizations like yourself, local communities, national organizations have to develop projects, have to raise awareness of what really needs to happen. A lot of this has to come from the bottom up. We can't expect countries that don't have the local context to develop projects and bring ideas. And I think that's been one of those challenges, that in development, we've seen projects from one country come to the other, whereas it doesn't really cater for local needs. So we need to see more and more ideas, more and more projects coming in. I think what's been refreshing is technology and youth. We can see that, people like yourself are very aware of these challenges. They're raising this awareness. There are lots of technological solutions that are coming in that are trying to bridge this gender gap, making sure that women have access to financial products. They are part of the decision-making process. What are some of their specific needs that needs to be catered for? And so we're seeing more and more of that work coming in. So for me, I think we need to have robust projects. We need to recognize this. And then we need to kind of match that with funding as well. So funding has to be gender sensitive, but the projects need to be built up as well. So we're able to match the two. And I think that's where a sweet spot will come in.
Okay, very well. Thank you so much for that response. Talking about projects, climate finance, and the rest, because I know that women have been resilient when it comes to bringing up ideas. They have indigenous knowledge. Recently, one thing that my organization, the LiQWYD, is doing is the fact that women's land rights, it matters for us to be able to bring in indigenous knowledge, bring in innovativeness, ideas in solving the defining issue of our time. And I think it has to do with the local, cultural, social issue, trying to say that if women could have access to land, definitely it could help them to access loan. Without access to land to a certain extent, it might be difficult for them to be able to access loan. So it has to do with a whole lot of progress, a whole lot of processes too, structures and the rest. But then when it comes to sensitivity to climate finance, I think there is more to be done, just as you mentioned, to see how we can bridge that gap, how we can include them to break all barriers when it comes to social, cultural, environmental, and economic factors that could affect women's rights. And just to conclude on our discussion today, just not to take your time much, I just wanted to give us a summary. I saw one of your articles you wrote on natural science, how climate change impacts people, how the effect of climate change. You gave it 3 factors in that explanation. And I just wanted to use it as a concluding part of this interview on what's your view are, because you mentioned understanding climate change, how people are affected when it comes to social science, and when it comes to natural science, understanding climate change, and when it comes to management science, how responses are planned and organized. So it has to do with natural science, management science, and social science. So you just help us conclude with that 3 factors. So you just help us conclude with that 3 factors. Like what is the state of climate finance in our day-to-day on that 3 factors?
So that's a really important point to think about, that in order to solve the climate challenge, we have to develop multiple perspectives. We have to look at the challenge from different lenses. I think the first lens that was there was the natural science, the climate science lens. And we've seen IPCC, we've seen, every other year, new reports, new research comes in that really talks about the challenges. And we've done some amazing, excellent work. I think where we are right now, yes, we need more science. We need to understand the causes, the levers, the challenges, but we don't need the science to convince us that climate change is happening. So natural science or physical science has played a very instrumental role. I think there's a lot of work that's happened in social sciences as well over kind of the same period of time, where we've looked at society, we've looked at how climate change translates into socio-ecological challenges, which means how does climate change meet people, societies, the natural environment, and what are those impacts? How do people deal with that? How do they are impacted by that? What are some of the vulnerabilities that come in? And rightly so, you pointed out that asset ownership is one of the strong vulnerabilities for adaptation. If you don't have land, if you don't have ownership, you can't get access to funding and finance. And that creates barriers, especially for women who don't have that ownership. So we need those social structures to change as well. We need social science to come in and talk about, or political science to come in and talk about reforms, or talk about, having a much more equitable way, or finding other ways of overcoming these structural and social challenges. I think what has been missing in climate change is the management and organizational side of it. And I think this is what we saw at the COP as well. That the big demand was action. How do we translate policies, science, this understanding into real, tangible actions? How do we measure those actions? Is this really making a difference? Is this actually helping people adapt to the impacts of challenging? And I think that's where the management literature, the organizational literature has been very active. They're not so much focused on the climate change side of it, but what they really focus on is how do you organize action? How do you implement policies on ground? And so part of my work really has been trying to bring this management perspective in and say, okay, there's so much work that's gone in terms of setting the right organization. Like, how do you create the right structures for implementation? We've always relied on countries or development organizations to implement projects. I think now is the time for private sector to come in as well, because they are one of the main contributors. So how do you get private sector to get involved in this process as well? And I think that's where management theories, companies to have a moral license to operate? Is it about making sure that the taxation regimes are fair? So there are many elements from management and organizational theories that can encourage private sector, these huge actors that were really not, were standing outside the fence, to really come in and participate and being active. So I feel bringing all these different perspectives will really help us to mobilize the right resources, the right actors, the right structures for climate action. And I think that's where I feel that the management literature or the business world now really has to step up and play a very, very critical role. You as activists, as development professionals, have been raising these voices. And I think it's time for
action,
relevant actors to come in and make their contribution. I think that's where management and organization and the business world or the business schools from academia can play a really important role in training the next batch of leaders to take these challenges more seriously. And we've seen that companies that are focused on that, think about these challenges, actually make better decisions and are successful in the long run. And hopefully we'll see more success cases coming out.
Yeah, thank you so much. You've mentioned a whole lot of things that we want to hear, we want you to address, we want you to contribute your expertise in, and very well. You also mentioned about policy. Policy and structure goes hand in hand. If there's policy and the right structure is not there, it's like no work done. And when the structure is there and there's no policy to back it up, like no work done. So it works hand in hand. That when there's policy, there should be the right structure, which has to do with management, natural science, and the rest. So thank you so much. Just a reminder that everyone is needed in the fight for climate justice, and climate finance is very important in dealing with the impact of the climate change crisis. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate this.
Thank you so much for the invite, and I, look forward to more insights coming from you. And as I said, my encouragement for younger people is that, it's really important to raise awareness. It's really important to unpack some of these black boxes of climate finance, climate policy, because once you start looking inside, you start to find better challenges, better solutions. So, good luck with your work, and very happy to contribute to this discussion. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.